In the year 431 BC, the city-state of Athens was the greatest power in the Mediterranean. Under the leadership of the patrician Pericles, this tiny state had built a naval empire that stretched across the Aegean. Her mighty fleet of trireme warships was the most powerful of the day. Athens lay at the center of a great trading network that dealt in goods from as far afield as Britain in the west and India in the east, bringing untold wealth into the city. And Pericles had personally devoted himself to making this city the most glorious of the ancient world. He had commissioned the Parthenon, a mighty temple to the goddess Athena, one of the most extravagant monuments in ancient history. But for all his power and sway, Pericles did not rule this city. For Athens was a democracy. This is the assembly area of the Pnyx, home of Athenian democracy. The system that gave every Athenian citizen a say in the running of their state. Here, Pericles had to stand before his fellow citizens and win the right to lead. One day in the year 431 BC, Pericles took the podium and presented the Athenians with a bold new plan. A proposal that would offer Athens her final crowning glory. Pericles intended to vanquish Athens' last great rival, the city-state of Sparta. Sparta was the only other Greek state that matched Athens' power. The Spartans ruled all of southern Greece, and they were a fearsome military force. Their citizens were trained from birth in the arts of war. Tension had been building between Athens and Sparta for decades. To Pericles, it was now time to take on this dangerous adversary. To make Athens the undisputed leader of the Mediterranean.
If we go to war, as I think we must, be determined that we are not going to climb down. For it is from the greatest dangers that the greatest glory is to be won.
The assembly embraced Pericles' plan. The Athenians were never ones to shrink from a fight.
The ancient Greeks as a whole were not by any stretch of the imagination a peace-loving people. Peace was an interruption of war rather than vice versa, and the Athenians were as bellicose as any other Greeks.
But Pericles knew that any war with Sparta would not be easy to win. For the Spartan infantry were far superior to Athens' forces. Athens' strength lay in her navy. So Pericles proposed a strategy of astonishing complexity and sophistication. He convinced the Athenians to abandon all the land around Athens and retreat behind the great long walls that stretched down from the city to its harbor at Piraeus. Pericles would supply the city by sea. Merchantmen would bring in grain, wheat, and other essential supplies from Athens' colonies and allies across the Mediterranean. protected by the mighty Athenian fleet. And Pericles would use this great navy to attack the Spartans from the coast. It was a strategy based on a set of finely judged assumptions.
Pericles' expectation was that after a year or two, but no more than 3, the Spartans would realize that they could not win the war because the Athenians would never give them the infantry battle they needed in order to win, and they had no other device available.
Athens' fleet had always been key to the city's success. It had won the city great military victories, and it had built her an empire. Pericles was sure that this fleet could now bring Athens her greatest triumph. The Athenians crowded behind the city walls. Confident in their vision of imperial power and glory, they assumed that Pericles' strategy could only bring them victory. But among this teeming multitude could be found one man who refused to assume anything. A man unique in Athenian society. A man called Socrates.
If you were an ancient Athenian citizen, the first thing you'd see is a man who was unbelievably ugly. His head was too big, his eyes were too large, his nose was all the wrong shape. Socrates' appearance breaks every rule of classical Greek aesthetics, of the idea of proportion and measure.
Socrates walked the streets of Athens barefoot, clad only in a dirty robe. He cared nothing for appearance or any of the other conventions of his day. Socrates was interested only in the mind. This unlikely figure would become the leader of a revolution. A revolution in thinking that had been gathering strength across the Greek world. For thousands of years, mankind had assumed that the world around them, the sun, the stars, and the moon, were gods and spirits. Believing they were recording messages from their gods, ancient civilizations such as the Babylonians had gathered great catalogues of astronomical data. This detailed astronomical calendar from Babylon records the rising and falling of the constellations and the gods they represented. This knowledge and study of the heavens had been slowly spreading across the ancient world until it reached Greek colonies on the coast of what is modern-day Turkey. There, a shattering change occurred. For the Greeks took this astronomical knowledge and transformed it. They took the gods out of the heavens and replaced them with reason.
Gradually, the Greeks begin to say, these are not persons, these are things. There's an orderly world which the human mind can actually capture. It is subject to our understanding.
These Greeks began to calculate and predict the movement of the moon and stars through mathematics and logic, rather than using gods and spirits to explain everything. It was the birth of science. The first great Greek scientist, a man named Thales, wrote the earliest book on navigation and how to sail using the stars as a guide. And on a journey to Egypt, Thales was the first man to measure the height of the Great Pyramid.
Brilliant idea. He stood next to the pyramid until high noon, when his shadow was exactly the same length as his height. And at that point he measured the shadow of the pyramid and accordingly knew the, the height of the pyramid, which is actually an application of a rather sophisticated geometrical theorem.
These Greek scientists would go on to measure the circumference of the world when most people still thought it was flat. To devise steam engines, water pumps and suspension bridges. But Socrates was not interested in the mechanics of the physical world. He would use this new way of thinking, using reason and logic, to study people.
The great change comes with Socrates, who turns his back, so to speak, to the world of nature. What he cares about is the individual. You become an object of study and care.
Socrates spent his days in conversation, walking the streets of Athens, talking and debating with anyone he met. With over 150,000 people now packed behind Athens' walls, he was in his element.
One of the amazing things about Socrates is that he is the first fanatical urban individual. He loves the city. He makes life in the city one of his major concerns.
Socrates' life was spent questioning the assumptions his fellow Athenians held about their lives. What they felt was right and wrong, what was good and bad. And he was happy to turn convention upside down. One of Socrates' followers recorded how, at the end of a drunken dinner party, Socrates proved to a fellow guest that he was in fact the better looking of the two.
My eyes must be more beautiful because they bulge out, and therefore I can see better. And by the same account, my nose is more beautiful because my nostrils flare out, and so I can therefore gather in more smells.
This is typical Socrates, using reason and logic to examine the world anew.
Socrates says you must make every decision based on your own understanding of what is good and what is not good, what is right and what is wrong.
For Socrates, this freedom of thought was paramount, even if it meant upsetting the whole notion of a beautiful nose.
I tell you, let no day pass without discussing all the things about which you hear me talking. A life without this sort of examination is not worth living.